Like at the end of the day, you got to build drugs, you got to put those drugs in patients, and they have to help patients. That's what we're all here for. We're not here to make really pretty data plots of preclinical data. We're not here to cure mice of fake cancer. We're here to put drugs into patients that give patients value.
This is the Nucleate Podcast, the voice of the next generation of biotech leaders.
Welcome to the Nucleate Podcast. My name is Sam Kessel, and on this episode, my colleague Bianca Williams and I speak with Jake Becraft, the CEO and co-founder of Strand Therapeutics. Jake and his co-founder, Tosca Kitada, who's the president and head of R&D, founded Strand Therapeutics in 2017. It's a company that's focused on developing long-acting mRNA therapeutics that are programmable and engineered to enable precise control of the location, timing, intensity, and duration of protein expression. Strand is now a clinical stage company with its lead asset being developed for melanoma. It also has development for triple-negative breast cancer and other solid tumors. Jake has been featured in Fierce Biotech, Bloomberg, the Boston Business Journal, and BioCentury, among others, for his vision and mission at Strand of applying this unique platform for real-world disease applications. He's also been the recipient of prestigious national and international awards for his scientific and entrepreneurial achievements, including the Barry Goldwater Scholarship and Excellence in Education Award, the Andrew Viterbi Fellowship of MIT, the Amgen Fellowship, and the Bristol Myers Squibb 2018 Golden Ticket for recognition of Strand as an innovative startup. Beyond his work at Strand, Jake's broader interest spans synthetic biology, biologically engineered organism-machine interfaces, and the intersection of tech and biotech methodologies. He's an advocate among the life science entrepreneurial ecosystem for supporting young founders in biotech entrepreneurship. Currently, he serves on the advisory board of Starlight Ventures, an early-stage venture firm, and also serves on the executive board of Public Health United, a nonprofit focused on helping scientists better communicate their research for maximum impact. We had a lot of fun on this podcast and appreciated Jake's insights into biotech policy, his founding journey, and career advice for aspiring entrepreneurs. We hope you enjoy it. Jake, thank you so much for joining the Nucleate Podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So I want to start at the beginning. What inspired you to pursue a PhD and a career in biotech?
So I will say I never meant to pursue like a career in biotech. I don't even think I knew what biotech really was. I saw a video when I was in a freshman health class in high school. I always wanted to be an engineer. I liked the idea of designing things. And then freshman year in health class, which was not a very serious class, taught by my football coach, actually. That's why we were watching videos. But we happened to be watching a video about the pursuit of a vaccine for HIV. And they had these people in there that were working on designing these vaccines, and I just thought, like, what an insane job, like, to be sort of design. Like, I had no idea what it meant to like design a vaccine or work on a vaccine or do any of those sorts of things. And so it sort of got my brain moving into this realm of like, oh, maybe like engineering and different sorts of like principles can be brought to like try to treat disease. And so I started down this path. I ended up going to the University of Illinois. I grew up in Illinois, and then I went to the University of Illinois where I was studying chemical engineering. And really within the chemical engineering department, they had a subgroup called biomolecular engineering, thinking about how to use sort of this idea. Chemical engineering is a lot of processes. It's a lot of like systems thinking in terms of like, engineering chemical reactions and then applying that into biomolecular species was this like jump that was really interesting. And I ended up getting taken by this idea of genetic medicine. I started working on chemical engineering of nanoparticles for DNA delivery. And sort of that led me down this road that ended up at MIT with a PhD in synthetic biology, biological engineering and synthetic biology, where we really just were thinking about like, what are the underlying principles that will make genetic medicine realistic and scalable, right? What are the things that will leap us forward into like what we can do today and what we can do, 10 years from now? And the biggest issue that we ran into was delivery, right? Synthetic DNA is incredibly limited in its ability to access the nucleus. Synthetic things like messenger RNA, which were just emerging, could fix that nuclear delivery problem, but they're incredibly harder to direct in terms of delivery vehicle. Lipid nanoparticles are very promiscuous. And really, I went into all of that thinking that maybe I'd be a professor. I'd ended up doing a summer with Bob Langer when I was in undergrad. I got into this summer program that Amgen sponsors called the Amgen Scholars Program. And working with Bob was this like, you get to see the cool side of academia. You get to see like what translational research, academia, pipeline into companies looks like. Thought maybe that was a career for me, but once I got into graduate school and got to see like behind the curtain of academia, I realized that wasn't really my speed. And so I just got obsessed with like, how do I work in translational science, but not be a Bob Langer type scientist, right? And as our research matured, it became clear that this technology needed to make its way into the world, that it could have it could deliver on this, this promise that we thought we could do, which was like innovate on delivery and therapeutic index of genetic medicines, bring genetic medicines outside of, vaccines, rare diseases, and liver targeting to actually innovate in areas like cancer and immunology and places like that. And so I just sort of took the technology and went out and ran with it and started a company. That was it.
What I love about your story is how it's really just a series of small moments that kind of added up in small pivot points. It wasn't, spark of, lightning that made you decide one day, I'm going to be a CEO. It was more a series of smaller events that eventually got you there. Like your health class, which I'm assuming was not a common thing we hear about when we ask about people's career paths. Like, oh, like a video in a health class really changed my direction. But it's interesting how like small moments like that can change the way you think about things. And it sounds like it was like a progression over time that, you started out in chemical engineering, were originally pursuing and interested in a career in academia, and then over time, with exposure and working with awesome people like Bob Langer, that you eventually decided to pursue more of the business side of biotech and really the translation from, the bench to, ideally to the bedside. And in this case, I know that you guys are already in clinical trials. So really, living the dream of actually making a difference for patients.
Yeah, I think that the core thesis that everyone should think about when they're trying to, I don't know, design their career is less about like, a career is not a destination, right? I mean, ideally for, let's say, anyone under 45 right now, your career is going to be made up of like many different careers, and they could actually be incredibly differential, right? It could be that you're going to be at a biotech and then you're an investment fund, and then maybe you're at some sort of like institute. Like there's so many different areas that you may end up. And I think the more important thing to think about, especially when you're young and starting out, if you're in school, graduate school, even undergrad, is to think about what are the principles that really guide you, right? What is the, if you boiled like your interest down to like singular principles, what is it that you're actually passionate about? Because, I don't think anyone is, at least I'm speaking for myself. I'm not like, passionate about like being a CEO. I don't even feel like a CEO most of the time. I feel like a guy who like runs a lab and, is a leader and has to do different pieces. But it's not like, I walk around saying like, oh, Jake Becraft, CEO. It's more so that I care about translational science. And that's the thing that's been guiding me for the past 15 years of my career, which is I care about inspiring great science to work at the bench and bench science that can work with an eye to like how this will eventually impact folks, right? This isn't, I'm not, I love reading about it. I'm inspired by like research for the sake of research and exploratory research, but like, that's not what gets me out of bed to work on. And so I love working on that side of research at the bench, and then of building pipelines and efficient processes and building infrastructures to see that technology go really from bench to bedside in the most efficient way possible. And, when I was at MIT, when I realized I wasn't going to be a professor, I looked at a bunch of different careers and a bunch of different opportunities, but I realized they were all within that same vein. So I looked at like science policy, and I was involved with the science policy initiative, and I went to DC and I was like thinking about how could we build better frameworks to fund translational science, and how could we build better regulatory environments that could create more translational science and increase the amount of science we get to patients. I think that like, if you want to sit around and think about like, what should I do with my life? It should be around the principles you care about, understanding that like, once you hit those principles, then there's a bunch of different careers that you can and probably should go down the pipeline of, right? I mean, I think that I think a lot of people in the biotech industry should spend some time on the public service side of things. People should engage more with things like, FDA and policymakers, because we really need more interdisciplinary collaboration, and people to not say, I don't think anyone should say, well, my career is in biotech. I always worked for biotech companies. I think that that's maybe a little uninspired for some of the real leaders that we have emerging in the industry.
And I think that's great advice for folks. So it's not a, rigid, here's the ABC checklist I need to do to get where I'm going. It's more about what are the key themes that I see, the things that, inspire me, where, who do I want to help? And there's multiple different ways of achieving that goal.
Absolutely.
I definitely agree. And also just not putting yourself into a box. I think that's something that often we do, and you have to move away from that idea.
Now, for the folks not familiar with Strand, you mentioned already, Jake, that it's involving programmable genetic medicines, and the idea is with long-lasting mRNA therapeutics, and you're starting out in melanoma. So it'd be great to summarize briefly for our audience at a high level, what the platform technology is that you're developing, and what the applications are for it.
Yeah, so we're starting in solid tumors right now. Melanoma is one of the areas that we are looking at. But maybe to back up, the idea is that messenger RNA has, we call it a delivery problem, but really it's a therapeutic index problem. So the problem with messenger RNAs is that you sort of dress up the therapeutic index problem as a delivery problem. The delivery problem is actually twofold. It's that you don't get enough mRNA delivered into the cells and the tissues that you're targeting, and you get too much into non-target tissues like the liver and the spleen and the macrophages and things like that. That's actually a therapeutic index problem. That's like classic therapeutic index. You don't have enough, you don't have an effective dose in the target tissue, and you have too much off-target toxicity. That's what you're dealing with. And so when we think about it from messenger RNA standpoint, mRNA is not a drug. It's not a small molecule. It's not a silencing RNA. It doesn't go in and actually do some sort of biological mechanism that then has a therapeutic effect. It's an instruction manual for the cell types that it's delivered to read and convert into a protein, which is then the mechanism of action. The protein is the mechanism of action. And so that means the protein actually controls the therapeutic index. More protein in the target cells, less to no protein in the non-target cells. That's what we're after here when we design this. And so that was sort of the inspiration that led to the technology and the application that Strand is working on, which is rather than focus so much on okay, I need to deliver more / all of the messenger RNA to the target tissue, and I need to deliver none of the messenger RNA to the liver and the spleen and all those things, which people then dress up as a delivery problem. And you see all sorts of very over-engineered nanoparticles and lipid nanoparticles and all sorts of different delivery approaches, which, great approaches that hasn't worked yet. Maybe in the future, we'll see. The sort of more fundamental approach is to engineer the messenger RNA itself and to say, if we can program the mRNA with new technology, which allows it to amplify its signal in a target cell. So when it enters a tissue we care about, whether that is a tumor or a T cell, we want that mRNA to be 10, 100, 1,000 times more potent. We want it to self-replicate itself. We want it to express like gangbusters for the longest period of time that we can, amplify the on-target signal. While at the same time, if we enter a non-target cell, we want that mRNA to not express any protein. In fact, we want the mRNA to degrade and leave the cell through a degradation pathway as fast as possible. If you can engineer that behavior into the messenger RNA itself, then you can actually fix this therapeutic index problem. It seems very simple. I'll tell you, the last 11 and a half years of my life show that it's actually very complicated. And so that's the technology that we are working on at MIT, the MIT Synthetic Biology Center, led by Ron Weiss, who was my PhD advisor, also working with Daryl Irvin, who was our close collaborator at the Koch Institute, recently moved to Scripps. And so between those two and their expertise in both immunology and material science on Daryl's side, and Ron's Ron's expertise in synthetic biology, and sort of myself and Tasuku Kitada, who is the co-founder at Strand and the head of R&D, sort of being the driving forces behind the technology development. We were focused on this mRNA engineering problem. Now, lipid nanoparticle engineering enters you need particles that can deliver to the tissues you care about. You need all sorts of different bells and whistles. There's machine learning and AI components of how the mRNA is designed. There's material science on the lipid nanoparticles. There's computational biology in terms of how we actually build the sequences of the messenger RNAs themselves, and then automation and robotics that we use to actually make these drugs in a much more effective way. All of that sort of buckles into the under the hood of what you're building. But at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a pipeline of drugs that have behaviors that no other drug before has been able to really tackle in a way like that. And that's what we're starting to see now as we're entering the clinic and as we're actually having drugs that are coming forward and just beginning to actually help patients.
And that's really helpful background for our audience to understand that there are delivery approaches that are in development but really haven't been successful. And it's really interesting that you found a way to engineer mRNA so that's expressed in the cells and tissues that you want and degraded in the ones that you don't. And it's interesting to hear how complex the background is for it, obviously over a decade in development, as well as the machine learning applications as well to advance that forward. And it sounds like there's many different, disease potential so that you can treat with this, ranging from solid tumors to, I'm guessing, much broader than that based on this approach. And so you mentioned your advisor, Professor Weiss, and, for context for the audience, I know Jake through this Harvard Biotech Club crossover course, and you mentioned in this case that getting buy-in from him was important early on. And can you give a little context on how you navigated that with him and how, as a PhD student with relatively limited leverage, you were able to find a good solution that was able to work for everybody?
So I think it's important to understand, especially if you're going to start a company when you're in graduate school or wherever you're starting from. Everything's about getting sort of building credibility and sort of standing on top, sort of the old adage of standing on the shoulders of giants, right? You're sort of standing on or needing other people to buy into what you're doing in order to get to the next step down the line. And so I think when you're coming out of academia, really powerful, you're sort of you're a graduate student, you're whoever you are, you have a great school name behind you and your PhD maybe. But you really do need to, have people sort of on your side in this form of company advisors, your own advisor, if it's from the technology coming out of the lab. And so having those folks on your side is going to be really helpful to get that early sort of catch people's attention and actually get people to pay attention to what you're doing and understand, especially if it's a really out there idea, like you're going to reprogram messenger RNAs, you're going to need people to sort of understand why it's important. When you're in graduate school, if you're trying to get your advisor to do something extra, some advisors are really familiar with entrepreneurship and it's sort of building, and some are less familiar with it, right? It's very important, I think, as a graduate student to find ways to build bridges with your advisors, find ways that you can sort of say, listen, we're starting this company, we'd love for you to be involved. You can leave ultimatums on the table to get things going, but at the end of the day, I think that most people who work in science are trying to see science get out into the world. And so I recommend everyone to, figure out what's important to the folks that you work around the table with, right? What is important to them? Hopefully everyone is reasonable and you can build a pretty solid case around why this makes more sense for us to do this together, why this makes sense for us to work on this together. And I think that, you just sort of approach people from that positive location, and you build a coalition of folks that want to change the world.
That makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, key aspect of negotiations is understanding what drives your, the counterparty on the other side and figuring out how you can team up so that everyone is on the same page to get this, technology out to patients. And, obviously it's complicated with financial interests and, I'm sure with tech transfer office at MIT can be challenging. So it's interesting that you were able to find common ground on the most important thing, which is that we ultimately have the same goal of sharing this with patients someday. So aligning your interests that way. So You mentioned that you were starting this company while you were in your PhD, which I'm assuming is challenging, right? Like you're juggling a lot of responsibilities, you have your, thesis work to work on and all the rest of it. It'd be good to get a little bit of an understanding in terms of how you were juggling your PhD responsibilities, co-founding this company, negotiate, in addition to negotiating with your professors and the tech transfer offices. So basically, what was it like starting a company? I'm assuming you had a couple of years under your belt already by the time you're starting it. So you had, some of your foundational stuff taken care of and a little bit more flexibility, but just curious how you went about that while balancing all your responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, so I had a conversation early on with Ron about like my intent, like what are my career intentions, and like when I entered his lab, I explained, I told him I want to be a professor, and that's what all faculty kind of want to hear. Like, my legacy will live on. There'll be more professors that all come from my lab, and a few years in, it became clear to me that that wasn't the path for me, interest wise, and ability wise, whatever it was, it just wasn't what I wanted to do. And so as I was going through these career transitions, I got more interested in the biotech side of things as an avenue for translational science. I was looking at venture capital as sort of some place maybe I could work in, maybe an early stage startup I could join, something where I could just get my feet wet into this. When it became clear that my research itself sort of had legs, that it could be utilized within an actual drug program, it could actually make the basis of a company. It's what we always thought, but of course, like the science is maturing at all times. We started putting these various different pieces together, and Tasuku and myself did go to Ron and explain we were starting a company and that we wanted him to be a part of it and that we wanted Daryl to be a part of it and all of those different pieces. I think one other piece that I'd had a conversation with Ron early on was that like I was going to work very effectively. I was going to, sort of, I'm not someone who likes to be micromanaged. If you're going to like track how many hours I'm in the lab, you're not going to get a picture of the work that I'm doing. And if you want me to be in the lab for 8 hours a week, you're probably going to get less work out of me than if you just leave me alone and let me I'll work on my laptop at home. So this is before COVID, right? So people aren't working at home nearly as much, but I'll work on my laptop on the go and but also at the same time, I'm a student. And I expect to this is the only time in your life, like between undergrad and then graduate school, where you're going to have the sort of freedom and resources available to you to fully explore things, right? So I joined the Science Policy Initiative. I did trips to DC. So I was doing these like extracurricular activities. I was getting research done, right? I published a paper in Nature Chemical Biology. I was getting plenty of research done. We had a large DARPA grant. I was pulling my weight as a lab member, I felt. Could I have done more research if I had focused exclusively on only being in the lab 40, 50, 60 hours a week? I don't know, maybe. I mean, I might have burnt out and done less quality work. Who knows? But like I was very much trying to do those different sorts of things. And I think that's important for folks that have various interests to either get explicit permission or ask forgiveness, not permission, whatever you think is going to be the best route forward for you and your own advisor. So when it came time to start the company, I mean, I did tell we told Ron that we were going to start it. And I viewed, the company itself as the next step of the research that I was working on. And so from my point of view, like my job as a PhD student wasn't to publish as many papers as possible. It was to take a fundamental idea, boil that into a research thesis, then, execute on that research thesis, show that data, publish that data, and then find the next step for that research. And so the starting of the company and building of the company in my mind was really just the next logical step. I did it while I was in graduate school. It was, you have a lot of resources when you're a student. You're juggling it like anything else. I mean, there's, you have very little life in general. I think at the time I was probably, I used to get into lab around 10 a.m., 11 a.m., and then I'd work till 9 p.m., so I'd work pretty late. Around the time that I started building the company, it was more so that I would get into Tech Square, which is where the Synthetic Biology Center is, around 8 a.m. And there's a coffee shop called Area 4 Cafe in Tech Square. And I would basically post up there for me, I would set up meetings there from about 8 to 11. So you have about 3 hours to meet with people, basically anyone who would meet with me, biotech folks and advisors and investors, and basically anyone who wanted to talk to me about biotech, anyone who knew anything. And I would just sit there and drink coffee and meet with people. And then I'd go to lab at like 11. I'd do a little bit of work. And then around like 2 or 3 p.m., my co-founder, Tasuku, who was working in Europe at the time, would get off work in Europe and get done with dinner with his family. And we'd start up calls, usually with people on the West Coast. And we'd do calls together and talk to investors and pitch different ideas. We did that for about a year. It wasn't the most efficient process, right? But it was basically like working a second job. And so you're sort of getting the work done. You work, working in the lab, doing your, at this point, I'm more of a senior graduate student. So I'm kind of like mentoring younger graduate students, and I'm writing a couple papers and working on a few things and sort of, writing my thesis and getting other sorts of things like all together. So, the balancing was sort of tricky. It probably at times was less balanced and more of me just like working on this company. But, I also think that, like, especially if you're working on your own PhD work or work of like a lab mate or someone in a lab across the hall, and you're all working on putting an idea together, like, there's to me, I think that's a very powerful thing that you should do when you are a graduate student, because like, you're a student, your job is to gain the skills that are going to lead to your next job. And your job is to steward technology from the university that you're working on out into whatever its next step is. And so creating a company is doing both of those at the same time. It is stewarding your technology to its next logical step, and it is finding your job, which is also the point of going to school, right? Which is to prepare yourself for the workforce. And so I think everyone should, consider, if they're going to work on that space, I think it should be very well accepted. It'd be a lot better if we had like more formalized, fellowship programs to help people translate that science. I've told a number of the schools that they, seem to be slow to adapt.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point there that you made at the end. It sounds like MIT is on the more progressive side in terms of having students work on companies, and that there are many professors who have experience, like Bob Langer that you mentioned earlier. So it sounds like there it's a little bit more, but it sounds like there's still plenty of opportunities to make more formalized programs for people to help start companies that are funded.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things that you really just need is sort of like dedicated time. And you can create that dedicated time by, sleeping less and working more. You can create that dedicated time by having it actually set aside. And I think that like Harvard Business School has a program called the Blavatnik Fellows. It's for HBS graduates to take, like, I don't know, 1 or 2 years after graduation to identify Harvard technology and then spin it out into a company. I think it's a wonderful program. I think it's based off of a sort of flawed premise in that that you need a MBA business student to take like science technology out into the world, that scientists can't, do it themselves, which in some cases is certainly the case, or scientists aren't willing or ready or whatever to do it. Just because you did the research doesn't mean you should jump off and be the CEO or run some company. But I do think that we're in desperate need of, sort of this bridge funding like structure, some sort of fellows program, some other billionaire or the Blavatnik Foundation themselves to step up and create programs at some of our top institutions for our most promising scientists to have, 1 to 2 years. Bob Langer is really great at starting companies. If you talk to anyone who's spun out a company within Bob Langer's lab, what they'll say is a lot of them, Bob is very good at structuring those transitionary periods for people, right? People are graduate students and then they're thinking about transitioning, and then maybe they have like a, what people sometimes refer to as a faux doc, right? Where they're like postdocing, but really they're like working on this idea, and they're being, paid, and they're helping around the lab. They're doing those things, but really their focus is getting this out into the world. I think that works if you have a Bob Langer as your advisor and he's bought in on the idea and willing to structure it for you. But it doesn't work, it doesn't work in a number of cases. It doesn't work when the PI and the graduate student disagree on the next steps of the technology. And I think, I believe that it should go to the person who did the fundamental research themselves, which is the graduate student, not the professor. And they should be allowed to take that technology and go work on it. There's a lot of issues right now, like so so many issues with everything from university technology licensing and the structures thereof, and how TTOs and TLOs operate, and how they sort of allow professors to sometimes abuse the system at the cost of the students. And then there's also issues of, how power structures inherently exist in the employment of graduate students and postdocs within these systems. There's a third issue that we didn't face, which is that of immigration and people who are on like various different types of visas. And so a singular fellowship structure that allows transitionary period for translational science is, I think, could create an incredible amount of value for students themselves, for the economy, and for the innovation ecosystem, the universities themselves, as they need the technology to get out just as much as anyone else.
Yes, I think that's great, and I agree. Is it possible for you to share with our audience some harder key business skills that you would find beneficial for them to learn? So outside of a program, if you're a scientist and you're looking to move into the business side, what skills would you say they need to work on? I know that varies by person.
Yeah. I think like for a lot of scientists, right? It's more so I don't know that I would call them business skills, though business, like MBA students tend to like have these skills more than scientists, which is communication skills. And, scientists are taught, so a few, I'll start. Communication is probably the biggest one. Scientists are taught how to communicate with each other. And it's very effective. It's a very effective form of communication when you need to write journal articles, you need to talk at technical conferences. There's a lot of jargon. The motivation, how you motivate things can be greatly abridged, right? So, you go to a synthetic biology conference and you start talking like, we all know that genetic circuits should operate more digitally, and here's an approach for more digital genetic circuits. And it's like, you go to an investor and you pitch your company as like, well, we're building a more digital genetic circuit structure because obviously we all know we need that. And then you jump into like how the technology works. That's not motivation, right? You haven't explained what that does in the world and how that really that's like the fourth part of the solution is this digital genetic circuit piece that someone needs to dig to find. You need to start with like, well, right now this problem exists, and this problem could be fixed by genetic circuits, and genetic circuits have this limitation. No one's been able to really crack it. And if you were able to make them more digital, like that sort of layering of the motivation needs to exist. And that's why they call it deep tech, right? I mean, it's deep in there until you figure out what the real problem is. And I think scientists really lack, on the whole, the ability to zoom themselves out to 35,000 feet and look back at their technology and the fundamental issues that are facing it and create narratives around what they're trying to do and why it matters in the world. Why? No one will learn until they care. And they will only care when you explain why. I think the second piece is, scientists really need to make sure that they understand the point of, call it socialization, like networking, right? You need to be you're not going to have the connections within graduate school that you need to launch a company, from finance to, business and other sorts of aspects of sort of the world writ large. You're not going to have those connections. You're just going to have like whoever your PI knows and whoever basically within your class. And so you need to create an environment where you're going to be going out, meeting with folks, you have to for a year, we just took I took these meetings 3 hours every morning, basically every day, just boom, 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 trying to meet with every single person that would talk to me. You have to adapt that into your life and understand that that's a part of work. That is a part of your job, and if you're going to do this as a job, your job sort of now is a lot of that. And so you need to maintain that connectivity. You need to build networks. You need to build support structures. You need to build coalitions of folks that like this idea or want to help with this idea. And so that's something that I think like sort of business people do well. I don't know that it's a business skill. The business skills themselves are highly trainable or hireable, right? I mean, like negotiating your first term sheet, like, yeah, is that a business guy? Maybe you'll learn about it in business school. You could read a book on it. And then like, if you get a term sheet, you should have a law firm lined up, and then you should have one or two advisors that understand like early stage investing that you've brought on to your company by that point. And so they should be able to weigh in with you about like what they like, hey, I would give on this, I would not give on this, I would change this, I'd push for this. Term sheets are a lot more than just valuation. Valuation's a big piece that gets into a term sheet. And then when you sort of like get the company up and running, you do need to have like either before financing or right after financing, you need to build that development plan, right? So you need to say like, okay, what are the inflection points here? I think understanding like what the pieces of like if you're going to be in drug development, what the pieces of drug development are. If you're going to be in like non-therapeutic biotech, you need to understand what your business model is. Who are you selling to? Like, why are you selling to them? What is their current structure, and how are they incentivized to change or not change? See this a lot in like scientists who launch companies with novel technologies to like disrupt something, and they don't understand that the thing that they're disrupting is a minor piece of someone's cost basis with a huge change cost. That's an awful place to be in, right? Like, for example, a lot of people jumped into like viral manufacturing, for instance, in the biotech ecosystem. And a number of those companies struggled, and a few of them failed and went under because they thought that they would build new cell lines to produce viruses. What they didn't understand is that companies are so risk adverse on this piece. And by the end of a commercial drug, that cost of manufacturing is such a small piece, the cost of the drug development, that they're not incentivized to take a giant risk on a brand new technology that has both technological and regulatory risk in order to save 5% on their eventual development cost. And so you need to understand like who your customer is and how they make decisions. I'd say, that's probably the most like businessy skill. And a lot of times it runs in when you're not in like an actual therapeutic. Therapeutics is sort of like, you need to understand what the steps are to get a drug approved. You need to understand what the steps are to build a drug. You need to understand how costly it is to get there. And you need to understand what actually matters, right? Getting a development candidate, especially in today's market, it's great, like good job, but like, it's not like some huge inflection, right? You need to get a drug into patients and start to prove out a thesis before people are going to give you large amounts of value.
Right. And speaking of this, I'm eager to know if there were any key decisions that you had to make within your company as you grew into a more mature company with a clinical product.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton, right? I mean, being a CEO of probably any company, but I can only tell you about like various startup phases, is essentially just like putting out various different fires and then making like like decisions that have huge impacts on the future, but like making them every day, right? So every day it's like, well, we have to make like, what are we going to do about this? We have to make a call like now. And you need to like, oh, okay, well, this is what the clinical trial is going to look like. Okay, is this the best bet? Well, let's ask 4 advisors, and they all have varying different ideas. Oh, I'd actually look at this, I'd look at that, I'd look at that. Well, okay, someone has to sit and say, well, what we're going to do. And so I think that like key decisions that we've had to make, I mean, when we were, at a certain point, we were early on, we were growing to build a research program that could show that the drug, was developable, right? This could be a drug, right? So we sort of have a manufacturing plan. We sort of have a preclinical package. We have some efficacy. We have some reasons to believe this will work. And here's what that looks like. That's like your seed stage, right? Can we put together a functional company that does research? That's like a seed stage goal. You raise a Series A, and that's really about bringing, like, I would say nowadays, it really needs to be about bringing that drug forward, right? When we raised that Series A, it was in a little frothier market time. And so we both had the luxury of, and probably the handicap of, investing quite widely because we wanted to build up our platform at the same time. Nowadays, I think you really need to stay laser focused on getting getting to that first inflection, the first in human piece. It's just where you'll see value increase. You can build out the platform at the same time, but you need to be very cognizant on like where you're spending your capital. I think that then, what the decisions we've had to make since then are, what are the new areas that we will continue to invest in? I think the most successful companies long term, right? The companies that are 10, 50, $100 billion biotech companies, 20 years down the line, are going to be ones that both built drug programs but kept a hum of research underneath them, right? Companies like Alnylam that were able to like build drugs, put them into the clinic, test them out in patients, but at the same time, there's this technological development going on underneath it, right? They weren't afraid to disrupt themselves. They weren't afraid to develop the first LNP drug, but then bring forward GalNAc systems and conjugates that were going to a completely different approach, right? From a platform story, you've blown up 50% of your platform and saying like, now you're not using LNP. I thought this whole system was built around these LNPs. You have all this expertise in LNPs. Now you're going to use a completely different system. Like, why? Like that's off your platform. And I think that like the ability to continue to do that research and then to disrupt yourself, you have to do it in bio. You have to do it in general, but in biotech, it can be very hard because like at the same time, you're still pushing forward those first drugs that came out of your platform. You're still pushing them forward. You're still sort of moving them into the clinic.
Speaking of that, like, are there some larger trends within biotech that you think could change the field currently?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially right now with like how the market's pulled back on folks, you have this, yes, assets are important. Assets, like at the end of the day, you got to build drugs, you got to put those drugs in patients, and they have to help patients. That's what we're all here for. We're not here to make really pretty data plots of preclinical data. We're not here to cure mice of fake cancer. We're here to put drugs into patients that give patients value. And so what we need to think about as an industry is just to say, okay, how do we continue to bring those assets forward, but also make sure that we don't destroy the value that these companies are building up in terms of just their institutional knowledge? So for instance, like treating each company as if it's just like a financial house for your asset value, I think is also incorrect. It's an overswing of the pendulum just because when everything got very frothy in 2020 and 2021 in the market, what we saw was an over-indexing on platforms and platforms that like showed a few animal studies and then they were IPOing at $1.5 billion and trading up to $3 billion market cap. And that's very silly, right? Because at the end of the day, again, they're not bringing drugs forward. But at the same time, if we over-index on the asset side and we only invest in the asset and the asset's value, and we allow financial incentives to squeeze companies down so that they only have enough cash to get to their next inflection point, and then we use that inflection point to decide whether or not they get more cash, and we're just drip feeding them until they finally prove out that the drug could get to the commercial market, then we're completely nuking the sort of industry knowledge that sits in the middle, right? This is like what people are with the reindustrialization movement of the United States. What people are talking about, what's been lost in outsourcing our manufacturing to other parts of the world for the past 50 years. What the United States has lost in that time is institutional knowledge base, right? People who are able to, people who understand what the challenges are and how to innovate on top of them. And that is what we're losing. We're losing an institutional knowledge base of drug development when we squeeze companies down like that. When we take the teams that already put 2 or 3 drugs in a certain modality into the clinic and we squeeze them down and we say, now only focus on those clinical stage drugs, cut your research, cut and do these things. If we could see the industry change that way, if we could see financial incentives change, if we could see more investors from either biotech specialists or generalists or large mutual funds or folks come in and recognize that value in a way that incentivizes companies to continue to keep that research hum going, I think we'd see more Alnylams emerge. We'd see more Regenerons emerge than, we've really only seen 5 or 7 sort of generational biotech companies emerge in the last 25 years. And I think that that's low given the amount of capital that's gone into the space. We can't only use pharma M&A as the only real exit. Right? We have to build self-sustaining companies. We have to build companies that grow and scale and become industry leaders on their own.
Absolutely.
And I think what's interesting that you're describing is that we've been on either side of this, in 2021 especially, you saw like really frothy market, huge investments for platforms, and all about like the potential opportunities rather than focusing on like what can actually be achieved, like clinical, development wise. And now you're right, like since the market cratered really in 2023, there's been a really hard focus on, can we get a single asset into the clinic? Don't worry as much about the platform. So it's really swinging both ways, and hopefully we get to kind of a happy middle where there's still investment in platforms like you described with Alnylam, where you're advancing an asset, but not excluding development of your platform in the meantime.
And I'll say one last thing on that. I think that like this is why policy is important, because policy and regulatory reform, I think, could completely help with these pieces, right? So if we have regulatory reform, which allows us to build more effective clinical trial mechanisms, more efficient clinical trial mechanisms, if we can decrease the cost to going from idea to first in human, which is the biggest cost in terms of value of capital that a biotech company hits, right? A biotech company's biggest piece of cost is idea to first in human, because that is where capital is the most expensive, right? You're the lowest valued company, and it's so expensive and sort of a long timeline to get to that first in human data set. And then the second piece is the value from clinical proof of concept, like an actual, like not first in human, but an actual like, hey, this kind of works, to commercial, is another piece that we have to find a way to both build efficient mechanisms, regulatory mechanisms, and build markets that can be more predictive, or ability of companies to access capital that is not just investor capital, to close that gap, right? And so, the fact that I showed that this drug works, and it works in humans, and now I need to run a $250 million phase 3 4-year trial before I can sell this drug. I understand why the regulatory bodies have stepped in and said, this is what we need before we're able to do that. But we need both regulatory reform and some sort of commercial outlet for those companies to be able to drive revenues that is not just strictly investor capital. Because the need to use investor capital to close that 250 million gap is why companies take exits, is why companies sell themselves off to larger pharmas, is why things become verticalized, because you sort of look at the value of capital and what it's, because investors are looking at it and they're saying, well, it's not really an inflection, like it's an inflection point in that you're going to get to a commercial market product, but it's not like, well, if I take it for granted and I say this does work, now I'm answering a $250 million problem, but like I sort of already assume it works, right? So you don't have a 10x potential on the value that I'm putting this capital in for. So we need new markets, we need more new commercial outlets in order to close that gap as well. And that's where I think, the US government, other governments around the world, good policy reform, and regulatory reform can work hand in hand to sort of actually incentivize and create both markets and opportunities that can close both those two gaps. If we're able to do that, I think we massively increase the efficiency of drug development, we shrink timelines, and we get drugs to patients faster.
Yeah, and I mean, and you've identified this, the problem earlier too, like there's with having fellowships and postdoc funding available for folks. And it sounds like there's multiple different policy angles with your policy experience that you mentioned earlier that you're thinking about that could really solve the capital needs problems. And when you talk about the cost of capital, giving away bigger shares of your company earlier on in, as well as when you're trying to reach that commercial stage, and incentivizing companies basically to stay independent longer.
I feel like we've covered a lot of really good information over this time, but we would love to know, outside of biotech, what are some of your hobbies and passions? A little bit about you on a personal level, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I had a baby beginning of this year, my first child. So, becoming a dad has been my major hobby of this year. It's been a phenomenal experience. It's just an incredible thing to be able to do, and just love this little baby and see him sort of grow up over the past months has been incredible. Outside of that, like personally, I have just like two major hobbies. I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu and train here at a gym in South Boston, where I've been doing that since I started it early on in graduate school, and so it's been sort of a hobby of mine for the past 10 years. It's a great outlet for, it's a good opportunity for cardio and working out. It's also very meditative. There's really nothing else you can focus on when you're sort of fighting another person than like that exact thing. So it's very like really helps to like center my mind at least. And then finally snowboarding. I
Nice.
love to snowboard. I love mountains. I love getting out in the mountains. I love the mountain air. I love, picking up speed and flying around.
Nice. Another question, like bridging from that, like congratulations on your newborn. I'm interested in knowing, a bit about how you managed to incorporate family time while also maintaining, your busy career. Like balancing the two has to be challenging. If you could share a bit about how you do that and any tips for others who might be doing the same thing soon.
Yeah, I think it's sort of twofold, right? On one side, life's all about time management and what you want to work on, what you think is important, prioritization, and thinking through like, these are the things I'm going to do today, but at 2 p.m. or 3 p.m., I'm gonna be done. I'm gonna spend a few hours like hanging out with my son, and then he goes to bed early, and I can get back on. I can figure out whatever else I have to get done. Like those are sort of decisions that you're just gonna have to make, and whether you have kids or not, that's just like like being in graduate school, I remember like reflecting on the fact with a friend of mine who was working like these 20-hour days, like over the weekend, burning himself out. And I sort of was like, man, do you understand that? He's like, well, I have things to do. I was like, that's just life now. Like you
Right.
just have things like you can't just work until you don't have things to do because you just won't not have things to do from now until forever. Like it's not going to be a day on a Wednesday where you're like, well, everything's done. Like, I guess I'm done. And so you have to find a way to prioritize and be okay, like figuring out what you want to work on, whether you're in graduate school or running a company or working at, any job that is, inspired enough is going to be intense. I think the other thing that you have to really, if you're going to be a founder and a CEO or just a founder in general and run a company, you have to really embrace work-life balance. And what I mean by work-life balance is not that there is a balance between work and life. It's actually that your work and life are merged. Like they just are, right? Work is just in your life and your life is just in your work. And so like sometimes my son and my wife's, off work right now, taking care of our kids. Sometimes they come to the office. They just like play at the office because I'm going to be there all day and I'd rather than be there for a few hours and I get to see them in between meetings, but I'm going to have to be there. And, I set them up in a conference room. And sometimes that means like my wife and I are going out to dinner, but we're going out with like, a friend of mine in the industry that we need to spend time with and their, husband or wife as well. And we're just going to spend that time. And yeah, it's a personal meeting, but also it's for work. And we're going to talk about work, and work and life are just kind of run into each other. Sort of, where I think like Strand as a company, when you're a founder and you run the company and you sort of like, the company sort of mirrors some of your own attributes, and sort of the identity of the company and your own identity get sort of intertwined. And it's, that's like fine. That's how, people see it. I think it also is like your lives sort of intertwine with it. And so you have to embrace that. Like, there is no like, well, at 5 p.m. I'm done and I'm CEO Jake until 5 p.m. and then I'll see you at 9 a.m. tomorrow. It's just there are jobs like that out in the world. It's just not this job.
Right. Not running a company.
Plenty of other jobs.
Yes. Well, thank you, Jacob, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it. And I think it's been wonderful. So
Well, thank you guys for having me. This was wonderful. And yeah, best of luck with everything at Nucleate.
thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Nucleate podcast. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with future episodes. See you next time.